Hello, everyone. I'm excited to see you at the Power Platform Community Conference. My name is Leanne Zelsman, and I'm a Senior Product Manager at Microsoft. I'll be hosting a segment of the Power Platform Governance and Security Workshop where you'll learn about how we govern and administer Microsoft's own Power Platform tenant. For those of you on the go, don't miss out on the Low Code Approach podcast. It's a great way to stay informed and inspired about all things Power Platform, even while traveling. So tune in and join the conversation as we unlock the full potential of low-code development together. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to an engaging session with you all.
Hey everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Low Code Approach. I'm Sean Feeney, a Senior Product Marketing Manager on the Power Platform team, and I'm joined by...
I'm Wendy Haddad. I'm a Senior Cloud Solution Architect, Delivery Lead, and a former Microsoft customer. And I'm joined by...
Ken Aguilar, Principal Program Manager, who is eager to navigate with the help of our Copilot experts, who Sean will introduce. Sean.
Yeah, let's get connected with our new guest. We have a repeat guest and a brand new guest. We've got Sabin Nair, Principal Group Program Manager, and Nathan Helgren, Principal Program Manager on the Dataverse team. Gentlemen, how's it going?
Good. Thanks for having us.
Fantastic. Thanks for having us here.
Awesome.
Good. Well, it's good to have you back because I'm not going to lie. I am all ramped up from all things Copilot. And talking to customers and having some internal Microsoft events. So Sabine, it's good to have you back on. I know we grilled you a little bit last time with Jocelyn, and Nathan, welcome. You're about to be grilled as well. So
Totally fine. Thank you.
Let's start a little bit easy. I would love to understand some of our current extensibility options and even why people should consider extending Copilot. So kind of the whys and the hows.
Yeah. So, extending Copilots, the main reason you want to do that is when you've got a Copilot, it's going to have a specific focus when you build it. So, for example, Copilot for sales will be focused on accessing your sales data from Dynamics or Dataverse, or Copilot for customer service. But using the extensibility, you're able to connect to other data sources because, let's be real about this. People don't always have their data in one source. A lot of people have a lot of data in many places. So the extensibility gives them that flexibility to say, I'm using Copilot for sales, or I'm using Copilot for Microsoft 365, and I've got multiple places to get my data from. So with a few clicks, you're able to build this extensibility to go get data from any external system. It could be SharePoint or SQL from Microsoft. It could be Salesforce. It could be Freshdesk. It could be anything. And any place that your data lives, we can help you get to that data and then interact with that in a meaningful way through Copilot.
And are you ingesting that data, meaning I shut down wherever the source is and now that data lives in Microsoft? Or are you more just saying you're building a pipeline and allowing us to access that data? A little bit, how does that work?
That's a great question. Yes, the data does not get stored in Dataverse or Microsoft. So this is a direct access connection through one of various sources, and accessing that data from the source that it's in, makes active calls every time it gets that data, pulls it across, it displays it, and then it uses that through the LLM processes to be able to be handled in conversations and take actions on that. But the data always lives in the original source. So we're not storing anything locally. So if you're talking to any third-party source, we're actively requesting that data using the connection or a REST API or some other method. And when we do an action on it, we're taking an action at the source. We're not doing anything locally with that.
So I'm curious. Many of our listeners are, of course, very familiar with the connector ecosystem that we have throughout the product. Is the extensibility that we're talking about very similar to this? Do we have canned connectors, if you will? And can they build their own, maybe custom extensibility into their own private data source?
Yes. Go ahead, Sabine.
Yeah, most definitely. I think if you even take the first question and extend that, see, in general, the principle for Microsoft is we build a platform and let you customize it. Each business is different. So whether it's a platform and even in this case, connector, arguably every connector starts as a custom connector. So you build it for a purpose, for your particular space, for your particular needs. And then depending upon whether you're a ISV or a customer, you either take it further to a marketplace for others to use, or you keep it within your company for your company use. So there could be some homegrown databases that you're constantly seeking information from. Think of like you're a travel agency which has a bunch of Wikipedia and whatnot and other databases. And all you want to do day in and day out is you have several customer inquiries. So you want to pull that information repeatedly. That's the key thing. Since you want to repeatedly do something, connector is a perfect wrapper to all these APIs, and you can serve that information to your customer. And again, this is classic Gen AI. A customer email comes in saying that I want some itineraries for going for a safari tour in summer, and you automatically pull that information, put together a draft email, the end customer agent looks at it, looks everything good, and hits send. So you're saving like a good 30, 40 minutes shaving right there. So does that help?
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Sabine, so you mentioned building custom connectors, right? And then ones that are more publicly available through ISVs. When you talk about connectors that are used within an organization, can you define the scoping for us? Like, if I build a custom connector, do I have it available in all environments, so across the tenant? Do I have it available in a single environment? So if I want to have a very special project that I'm working on, like, what's the scope of that connector and how far and wide can I share that?
So it starts off with something very specific to your environment that you can further, like all these things are ALM capable. So you can further take it to cover rest of the tenants or within all the environments in the tenant and available for everybody to use. In fact, arguably, even in the case when you talk about viral, growth of any artifact, connector is something similar. So somebody starts using it locally, hey, people are interested, it further grows, and then it goes further, the circle of growth just keeps going from there on. So yeah, I mean, we've seen that with customers. In fact, most of the connectors sort of have that viral growth within the tenant that way. And again, as I said, the difference between a customer using it and ISV doing it is ISV will publish it to the marketplace for globally available for everybody once it's certified. So that certification piece is probably the difference between being available within the tenant and globally.
I'd like to add just an additional thought to that as well, is there is also the capability for an ISV, if they were building something that was more targeted and not meant to be globally used, but for a specific tenant, and they didn't want that to be a global item, they wanted to use it just within their organization, they also could develop that, and then they can release that through our solution architecture for application lifecycle management, or ALM, as Sabine had mentioned. And that will allow them to just distribute that. So if I had a particular company I was building something for and I didn't want everyone to see that global connector, I could build it and we could use that as part of Copilot. And then we could distribute that to all the individual tenants for that particular company without making it visible to anybody else. And it could remain entirely proprietary as well.
So as my brother-in-law is fond of telling me, we have too many TLAs, 3-letter acronyms. So for those who are there, ISV stands for Independent Software Vendor. Curious, how are we extending the built-in offerings that we have? What are maybe some of our plans there, if we can maybe talk about that?
There are many different ways you can peel this, but let me take one stab at it. Since we're talking about Copilots, Microsoft releases or has several first-party Copilots, like Copilot for Microsoft 365 and the role-based Copilots like Business Copilots, Copilot for Sales, Copilot for Service. So again, the theory behind all of this is the same. Like, we are building something generic enough for your needs. It's where you start, and you take that and further customize it by extending it. And you can extend in several different ways. And we are talking about the connector piece. So you take that, if you're an ISV, say you're building something for Copilot for Sales. So you will build a connector which is what people want to frequently use, get it certified, start off as a custom connector, get it certified, give it for public to use. So in the future, there is an option for people using Copilot for Sales to also call into that connector, which is connecting to external data. And that's one of the ways you can take an existing Copilot and extend it. And we've seen a lot of ISVs do this. If you look at our build, we had around 25 new plugins just come in from various ISVs such as DocuSign, Litera, and all these places. So that sort of gives you where these things are kind of heading.
I think this is related, and maybe we should have actually started here. And so I'm going to take a step back, and then I think we'll jump back to this topic because it's important. But it's been about 7 months since we talked to you about this topic. And I mean, that's a lifetime in the world of AI and extensibility at this point. So let's maybe back it up for a moment and start a bit more high level. What has changed? What has evolved in the last 7 months? And then I think we definitely will then tie this to that and then double click a little bit deeper.
I don't know if we've got that kind of time. We need let's
Well, I can take a stab at this, and maybe Nathan, you can add on. It's a great question. People assume that, hey, we can see like a million years down the lane, and we just know exactly what people want, and that's not quite true. At least in the case of non-box products, or even like in the space of AI, especially, things change constantly. So you're always fine tuning to what the market needs, and this is very relevant to this space. So if you look at the Power Platform conference last year, we put some hypotheses there, but like with some product, that, hey, this is how we are thinking. We believe people will like Copilots. We believe people will want to extend Copilots, and we are giving you abilities to take your existing connectors and convert those to plugins. Plugins is what means kind of equivalent for what connector was for apps. Plugins is for Copilot. So we put this out there. And I carried on, like, for the first month and a half, we heard a lot of interest, but we still didn't see movement in people like going and building it. And maybe it was, I don't know how to kind of quantify that, but after the first month or so, we started seeing movement towards the end of the year, and more so by January, and maybe people came back from the holidays, and the trend just went up from there. And I'm not saying it's like sky high, but the trend was very positive. So we saw more and more ISVs, independent software vendors, come in, more developers kind of roll in and say, hey, there seems to be something in here. People are learning, they're trying to figure out what does that really mean. See, AI is not talking to Copilot and asking for the weather today. I don't know how much fun there is in that. But true AI would be, hey, I want to go to work for a meeting at 10 a.m. And right now it's 8 a.m. Am I going to make it, right? At that point, I have to look up the traffic. I have to look up the weather, especially if you're in Seattle and it's raining every day. So you have to go through a bunch of these sources in real time, come back and tell the user with one summarized answer. It's like, for you to hit the 10 a.m. meeting, you probably have to leave at 8:45, given the distance from your home business. That would be taking some onus off of me. That would be reducing some repetitive toil, as we say, as we had envisioned Copilots to be. If that burden is taken off from the user, that's purely AI. So I think we started somewhere there, and we are kind of turning the corner and getting to those rich AI scenarios. So the ecosystem, I think, is sort of thriving. And I'll tell you one last piece, and before giving to Nathan, sorry for the longish answer. One interesting thing that I personally noticed as well in the case of connectors and plugins and even custom Copilots, and we'll hit that in a bit. There's the legal industry, several law firms or people, ISVs, catering to law firms who are building several plugins because they have a bunch of IP that they want people to interact with. So something like, hey, I got a ticket under these circumstances. Like, will this go any further? Will I actually, can I get away? Is there some things I can do to not get it on my record? So I think there seems to be a lot of value in having that Copilot interaction, especially in these things. And that's just not with the end user, even within the law firms, there is several more scenarios. And I can touch base on some of those later. But Nathan.
Yeah. And honestly, just like 7 months ago, that was even before I was working on this, honestly. So you were talking with Jocelyn, you were talking with Sabine, and I actually wasn't even in this space. And I came on after that. But some of the things have changed since then. I mean, we've made a number of big leaps. So first of all, Copilots were great. They were super interesting. There was a place to go, but it was also kind of difficult to extend them and do things. So back around May, we released this user experience that makes it easier. So it's with a few clicks and filling in a couple of fields, you're able to extend your Copilot. And that extension lets you pick from any of our existing connector infrastructure, which is like 1,400 connectors now, as well as anything custom you build. So you don't have to understand code, and you don't have to understand how to do, to build these manifests with metadata. You can just click a couple buttons and it's going to do what you want. We've also been working to extend that beyond just getting data. So there was discussion about, I can get data from multiple sources and use that to craft an email or craft a document response. But where we're going here very soon, and it's safe to say this because this is actually in our release notes, is that we are having the ability to take actions on that data. So not only can I go and get a record and look at, say, hey, tell me all of my open cases that are available today, I can pick an individual case and using the Copilot, say, update case number 7 and set the status to closed. and it will go and update the record directly. I don't have to open up any other apps. Don't have to do anything else. I can use contextual information to take actions on my records. And that's going to be huge because you're going to be able to implement this without having to necessarily go through multiple different applications to do things that you used to have to be able to, I can gather my data, but then I have to open my sales application to make a change. So that's another change that we have. We are also looking at, even though we built this user interface that we have to make it easier to build this, it's still, you got to do like 10 different screens to get to the end of it right now. And we're working to make that faster. We're working to make it so you have as few clicks as possible and have to answer as few questions as possible to get started. So you can, with a few pieces of information, jump right into connecting to your Copilot and your external source, start using that immediately, and then enhance that later with additional features that we have that are going to make it easier for you to manage these things, like maybe specialized cards that will display content versus just having a text output, or having the ability for you to have conversation prompts for users to say, instead of you telling me what you want, here are some optional questions that I can build into my Copilot. So when it first opens up, the user can say, oh, here's a button to say, tell me all of the cases that have been updated in the last 3 days. And you just click that and it'll run that query right away. And you can build those automatically to give people something to start with before they actually have to start using large language modeling. Before they're using the Copilot and actually having to write their own queries, we can give them sample queries to help them get started and give them examples on how to phrase those queries to make them more powerful and more successful on their own. So those are a number of different things that we've been focusing on recently. Also, it used to be only connectors, but we are pushing to have the ability to connect directly through REST APIs or direct API calls, which means that if I don't already have a connector for a data source and I don't want to go through the steps of building a connector, but I have an API, I can just connect directly to that API as long as I have credentials and get that data from that source. And that opens a lot of different capabilities because maybe I have a system that is proprietary and there's no connectors that exist for it already. And I don't have the time or knowledge to build that connector, but I know if I use this authentication and this particular URL link, I can go to the source to get the data. And I can use that to connect my Copilot to that source now. And I don't have to be a programmer to be able to do that.
So thank you for all these examples, Sabin. You mentioned, you don't need to know code to do this. If you've got this REST endpoint, you can go hit it and be able to go and pull data from that. But there's got to be some work that has to do, right? You don't just open up a screen and immediately, start building connectors and start, building these connections to endpoints, which leads me to this question of, is there any workshop going on at the Power Platform Community Conference that you want to plug and tell us where you can learn more about these things?
Yeah. So at the Power Platform Community Conference, there are going to be several workshops. There's one specifically that's going to be around Copilot and extensibility and basically building your Copilots, extending them using various sources, whether it's a connector or a REST endpoint, or maybe even using a prompt or other sources. You're going to be a lot of hands-on during that session to give you a lot of experience. There are also other sessions, like we have a Dataverse Essentials session, which is going to cover just kind of expanding Dataverse itself, but it is going to have a Copilot component. So if you're using Dataverse and your common apps, like model-driven apps and such, how I can integrate that with Copilot. There's a small section there. And there are going to be other sessions that are not necessarily workshops, but that are focused on, like I have one specifically about extensibility. And we'll be having a whole 1 hour session about how do I extend my Copilot and what options do I have and where are we going. So there's definitely a lot of opportunity to learn a lot more at the conference.
Yeah. And to add to that, Sean, thanks, Nathan. So, we have these workshops coming at various conferences. We have several bi-weekly engagements with the external customers, which is not necessarily workshops, but this is a place where you can come and ask questions with some of us and on the phone and the engineering teams. There are also some webinars that we'll continue to do. Now, despite of all this, right, there is still a lot of people. There are people who are coming on site. We have exec briefing councils, so we try and cover some of these things over there as well. There are still some gaps, I believe. What we are hearing from customers is they would like to see more fluidness in terms of these workshops, kind of not having to wait for a big milestone like a conference, like Ignite and whatnot. So one of the things that we have been ruminating with our marketing team is, can we do some workshops in the midst of between these milestones? So it's something that we are thinking through. I believe there is a decent amount of demand. But yeah, we would love to. One thing for the audience is, if you really think this will benefit you, we can try and come locally to your place and try to deliver some of these things. So Back to you, Sean.
Well, I'm going to jump in and not give Sean a chance to talk, or maybe even Wendy. So, with all of this change that we have, selfishly, I'm going to plug our workshop as well, where we'll be talking about the governance and security of Copilots. And we'll be doing several deep dives showing a lot of the newer features and technologies that we have that are centered around this. Because with all of this evolution that you all have been talking about right here, sometimes comes stagnation in other areas. So I'm a little curious, how are we thinking about governance and security? If anyone wants to touch on that quickly, if we can, not super deep.
So there's a number of different ways when we talk about extensibility that governance and security play a role. One of these, we've kind of been talking a lot about connectors right now. Anybody who's familiar with connectors knows that in order to use a connector, you have to have credentials and a connection. So the whole purpose of utilizing these connectors to get to that external data is not only that we have the ability to get to the content, but that we ensure the right people are accessing the content. So even though we're building these, when you first attempt to use it, it's going to ask you to connect and it's going to ask you for your credentials. And if you don't have the credentials, you can't connect to it. And of course, those credentials are verified at the recipient source as well to make sure that the person logging in has the necessary access. So that's one of the ways that we have, some of the governance and capabilities. Another thing that is being worked on as well is the administrative capabilities. So once you build these connectors or these extensions and we submit them, there'll be an ability for administrators to decide, are these allowed to be used by people or not within my organization? And they turn them on or not. But also during part of that is to set the permissioning. So it's not only I'm enabling this, but which group can access this. And that's kind of a work in progress right now. We're working to complete all that functionality, but somebody would be able to say, yes, I'm going to turn on this Copilot and it's going to be able to get data from Salesforce or wherever. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that only my sales team can see this, or only my upper management can access data from this particular source. So even though I've turned it on for my organization, if you're not one of those members, you won't see it as an enableable and selectable item because you are not one of the people who has permissions within the structure to be able to access that content. So that's another way of managing the governance as well.
If I can further extend on that, in fact, let me see if I can explain this in another way. So think of like pulling a common thread across all of this. So think of we talked about all these questions earlier. So we start with an idea, a custom connector is born because of the needs that I have. Somebody takes that and now we test it and whatnot, and things are great, and I want to publish it. I want to get it certified. I want others to use and benefit from this. So that's what the certification process is. As part of the certification process, it goes through several checks. We want to make sure it's functionally accurate. There is no abuse in terms of there are, from a security perspective, there are all these validations are complete. So there is a set of checks that are done over there even before it gets to the public market. From there on, when in the case of, for example, I'll take an example of Copilot for Microsoft 365. So say you're kind of taking a connector and publishing it for Copilot for Microsoft 365. Just because you certified it doesn't make it automatically available for everybody to use. That would be quite an administration nightmare too. So then there are checks and balances within the Microsoft Admin Center wherein it shows up. And I'm not too worried about the particular naming terminologies and everything, but think about there's a concept of an available apps with an admins can look at the Microsoft Admin Center. They can look at it and say, hey, so these are relevant. Maybe these things I'm not sure about this yet. So I probably can green on the first 3 or 4, and then I can deploy it for either the entire tenant or just for a subset of users. So I can foresee, and we're already seeing a lot of customers being very tight about this, because you can't just take any app that is available and just throw it in your tenant without knowing it. So there is a bunch of checks and balances built here, what we call governance, so that admins, they can easily figure out hey, which apps go through, which apps I'm going to look at later. So all these pieces are in place. It's just another way to look at once a connector is born and all the way till it reaches the customer or end user.
So I appreciate that. I'm going to put on the skeptic hat a little bit because I love what we're saying within the Microsoft context. But in the real world, I think the fact that we're talking about extensibility itself, there are many different softwares and competitors. And, many of our customers don't just have 100% Microsoft technology inside. which usually means different levels of security reviews, how they're positioning their own products, different admins. And so while I know that you're saying that you can build a connector or an integration and an admin on our side, on Microsoft side, has to approve it, the M365 admin, what if the admin on the third-party product, it doesn't want that data to be integrated with Microsoft, or there needs to be a security review? Do we have systems in place? And maybe you could also add some customer examples of how our customers doing this successfully in the real world.
From a customer perspective, again, right now, it's like we're connecting to an external source. And if you think about the way that the connector infrastructure works today outside of Copilot, if you think about how you use that with Power Apps or Dynamics or other things, it bases your ability to access the content off of the credentials you provide, and that speaks to the source. And we're utilizing that same infrastructure, that same content. And so if they have a connector that's allowed to connect to it and get that data, that is really the level of permissioning and control we have. So there's not necessarily, and Sabine can correct me if I'm wrong, at this time, our system does not have the capability for somebody to say, when this connector comes through, A is allowed, B is not allowed as a client to use this information. The connectors are just a direct connection to a source with the authenticated credentials that says I have access to this information. So from that standpoint, it would be a matter of within that organization to decide when they enable those through the administrative process or as they develop them, which ones they want to provide to the users. But there's nothing from the recipient side to say this is not available to Copilot. It is available to Microsoft Power Apps, for example. And so, Sabine, did you have any additional?
Yeah. So one of the ways I was thinking where this was going is, so yes, there are, as I explained, and I think Nathan talked about it as well, there are several checks and balances within when you're in Microsoft. And Wendy's question is like, but I'm on the outside. So there are customers who have very stringent requirements just based on the business they're in. So there is a concept of me drawing a private path all the way to your house from my house and making that whole thing secure, whether it's a private link or it's through a VNet. So some of these things are in progress and or getting delivered as we speak. So support for private links, support for VNet delegation, like some of these things is kind of caters to people who have these requirements of sensitive data. Does that answer?
It does, but I will politely say that it is often not the sole responsibility of our technology. It is also up to the individuals who are managing the third-party data sources to secure and control those things. So I often tell customers when they ask me, what are we doing? I say, well, what are you doing right now for your other applications where you have to have extensibility? How are you controlling the security there? And then tell them to look at it from that perspective and control it the same way or similar ways.
Yeah.
And I think that's a fair assessment, Ken, because really when you look at that, we do all that we can to ensure that we abide by the permissioning and the other credential verification that are present on the source we're getting that data from. And once we have that data, we're treating it respectfully and securely. Now, we don't have full control of every third-party piece of software on how they handle that because we shouldn't, right? It's something that belongs to that software. So what we can do is make sure that in every possible case, we're doing proper authentication, we're doing proper authorization, we're doing proper handling of the data and making sure that everything is being processed in a way that is encrypted and safe. Beyond that, part of that is always going to rely upon the data source itself and the owners of those sources to make sure that they are making the proper decisions on what they're going to allow access to for their individual data sets.
No, you're right. And I asked the question because it's a very common question, but I do think it is a very important discussion about there are limitations that we have, to your point, Ken. And I said on a previous podcast, governance is a team sport, and it takes everybody doing their part to make sure that it's secure. Unfortunately, I have so many more questions, and we're definitely going to have you back on. So we're going to work on scheduling that. But I know that we're running short on time. Maybe as we land the plane, if you could just share maybe your favorite customer example of how people are using this tool, and then we'll go ahead and wrap the episode.
I can give one. And I think that's also very forward-looking. Like at Build, we announced Copilot connectors, yet another, seemed like a brand name. What does that entail? What are the changes behind it? This is something we are actively ruminating over. We talked about several different types of connectors. There's also things like graph connectors, which lets you connect to graph data. So what we are thinking is, how does all of this come together to make the scenarios even more richer? And you talked about scenario. So some of the independent software vendors we work with, Peppermint in UK is one of them. And they are an example of catering to law firms. And they have an amazing scenario, which I think is true for every single company. And all of us, no matter, like, it doesn't have to be a CEO or a CFO or CTO, but everybody on a regular basis has to go meet a customer. But you just don't show up to meet the customer without knowing who they are. So you always do some homework. Okay, let me look up who is this customer and what is, and like, have they talked to my company before? Who's been engaged with those guys? So that part, like, imagine there was a easy way to get that information. If you just ask around, yes, sure, you may get some details after 3-4 days, connecting to 100 different people. But what if there's a system available to basically check to see, hey, has anybody from my company talked to this new customer? And imagine the response comes back and like, yeah, these 3 people have had all these different chats and different conversations, have exchanged a few emails in the last 3 months, and maybe something that happened even yesterday, somebody from your sales team made a sale to that customer. So it would be a lot better to go meet these people in with that kind of information. So if you look at there was a nice video that was put together for Peppermint, and that kind of, it starts off with a lawyer waking up to appointments and kind of going through all of this. Now, the only way this works is you are at that point getting information from various systems. You're getting information from Graph to figure out, okay, what are the touch points? What are the associations of this customer with my company because of the emails and whatnot? So there is a categorization of that. There is also like, okay, are there any existing or ongoing, any contacts in the CRM system, in this case, Dataverse? So that's the Power Platform side of things. So if you look at there is now a need wherein you have to reach out to either the Graph kind of rich information or the Power Platform to look up who are the business contacts and if there are customers already in the system. So all of this put together makes it for a very rich set of scenarios, which is true for like every customer. So this is something we're looking at. I should be careful before, like, I think Ken talked about 3-letter acronyms. There's a 4-letter acronym now called COCO, so Copilot Connector. Again, this is like more, we're having fun with it as we work on it. But do know this is something that we are actively ruminating over and expect to see more news on this pretty soon.
That's awesome. Sabin, Nathan, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time. And I have a inkling that we're going to have you on again in a few months to talk a little bit more about this topic. So thank you again for joining us, and we can't wait to dig in deeper.
You bet. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you all for having us.
Yes, thank you very much.